I want to talk about journalism from the ashes, because I think we're involved now not in a perfect storm, but in a perfect fire. Here in the United States, major forces have revealed the weakness of media and journalism. And those forces are Trump, COVID, the Black Lives Matter movement, and our own business. To go quickly through them. In Trump and QAnon and AfD in Deutschland, we now have no idea how to reach, inform, influence, and educate a third of this country and a smaller proportion of yours. We are, in the words of the researcher Dana Boyd, in an epistemological war, where we're saying, if I don't like you, I'm not going to like your facts. Where a lot of what people are saying is performative. They don't really believe what QAnon says, I think, but they want to believe it, or they want to make us believe they believe it. These people hate us in the press, and we must not empathize with their racism. So what do we do? Then there's the next force of COVID, and here we see the conspiracy theories coming home to roost. And if we cannot convince every citizen of our countries to wear a mask to protect themselves and their families and their loved ones, then what the hell are we going to do? And this is the lesser fight. Soon we're going to have a fight over vaccines, which will be vital to get out of this crisis. And we know some people are not going to believe the science. We've had, in this country, in the media, precious little influence on public policy. The same is true in the UK. The same is true in Brazil. And the result in these cases is deaths. Then comes Black Lives Matter. The murder by police of George Floyd, Jacob Blake, Breonna Taylor. These are the names that we now know in America. That and COVID itself revealed our failure in American journalism to reveal the systemic racism that is inherent in so many of our institutions, including our own journalism. How can we ever cover health again without understanding the fundamental inequity in it, or policing, or employment, or education? And in our newsrooms in America, they refuse to even count how many people of color are in the room. We just did at our school a study of leavers, of the journalists of color who are leaving the field. We are losing their talent. 65% of those we talked to decided to leave journalism. They weren't laid off or fired. They'd had it with the field because they weren't being listened to. They weren't rising. There was a recent academic paper by a professor named Jordan Taylor who found that in the early days of American newspapers, the newspaper proprietors themselves were part of and profited from the slave trade. Even Benjamin Franklin made money off the trading in human beings. We in journalism owe reparations to much of America. We've not begun to have that discussion. And then there is the fourth flame, the fire hitting us, which of course is our own business. In the United States now, every major newspaper company is either controlled by hedge funds or by exhausted families. And so we're not going to see the investment in innovation that we're going to need here. We're not going to see the effort to train people to do new things. Oh, we see it here and there. Just yesterday, I'm proud to say that we were part of the creation of a worldwide news products group. These are the innovators in our field. But I know from talking to them that many of them are frustrated where they are. And in Europe and Germany, I've talked to some media companies that still have, I'm sorry to say, a shamefully small proportion of their revenue from digital, a higher dependence on paper. And yes, I'm delighted that Die Zeit has more subscriptions than ever. That's a great sign for our field, but Die Zeit is special. The New York Times is special. Not every publication is going to be like this. So these are the four forces upon us: Trump, COVID, Black Lives Matter, and our business. And we cannot blame the platforms for taking our revenue or our attention. God did not grant us either of those things. Our customers and our users left us on their own and often happily. Our advertisers got a better deal from digital. More efficacy, more efficiency, more accountability, less risk. Facebook was not built for news, but our own readers took news there because we didn't provide the place for them to be able to share and discuss it. Twitter was not built for news. It was built for telling people what bar you're in when. But the public took news to them. When they witness things, they tell themselves on Twitter. They don't use us to do that. Google was not built for news, but it saw a need to curate our work and bring it together in a way that our industry did not provide. Nextdoor, a company in the US, provides the ability for neighbors to get together and improve their neighborhoods. We didn't provide that. And now there's TikTok from China, which I think is a step change in media because it enables people to collaborate, to make one video add to another, add to another, add to another. This is the kind of dialogic roots of media that we had in the early days of the press. We had when Martin Luther decided to publish in German so he could speak to a public and debated with Erasmus through the press. This was a conversation that occurred in media, and we've lost much of that sense. So I want it to be clear here that we are failing our readers. We are failing our customers, and we are failing society in America in media. I didn't throw any matches on the paper. I didn't set the flames. I do not rejoice in the fact that this is happening. But our media house is on fire, and COVID and Black Lives Matter and Trump threw gunpowder on the flames. So what if they burn down? The question I have today for you is, what will rise from the ashes? And this is where I think I have not been nearly radical enough in reconsidering what journalism can and should be. In not taking our assumptions that we are a factory making a thing called stories and content to fill a thing called publications. Instead, we exist to serve the public conversation, as Dr. Brosda said. That is so important. In fact, I've rewritten my own definition of journalism because I have tenure at my university and I can do obnoxious things like that. So my definition of journalism now is to convene communities into respectful, informed, and productive conversation. We exist to serve that conversation that Dr. Brosda talked about. Now, how do we do this? Well, I want to suggest that there is much to build. We are in early days, and there's much opportunity. There's much opportunity in Germany to build these things. And I want to suggest 9 things that I think we should do, we can do. The first is that we need ways to listen. The internet to date is really built to speak. Everyone is speaking, and I celebrate that because there are voices like Black Lives Matter that were not being heard in mainstream mass white media, and we can finally hear them. So I am delighted that we have all these voices. But we have no mechanism really to listen. There's not a conversation until you have both speaking and listening. There is an opportunity, I believe, to build new tools and new mechanisms to improve listening. That leads to number 2. We need ways to discover what's worth listening to and who is worth listening to. Now, this was a job, of course, that was once done by the institutions we know, such as publishing houses and media. But they've proven to be too limited for this conversation that has exploded around the world. And so the problem is when we hit Twitter and we hit Facebook, we don't know where to turn, we don't know who's worth listening to. Well, that is an opportunity. I tell my students all the time that when we journalists see a problem, we report it, we think our work is done, we go to the bar. But if you're an engineer or a scientist, you see a problem and you look for a solution. If you're an entrepreneur and see a problem, you look for the opportunity. These are opportunities. So how do we help people find quality conversation in this cacophony of democracy that we have right now? That is a second opportunity. The third, of course, is that we need better ways to inform the public. And here I think we must listen to other disciplines. We have to understand what goes on in the minds of people who don't believe in wearing a mask. We need to talk to cognitive scientists, psychologists, anthropologists, designers. We need to understand how they are thinking so we end up in this epistemological war of alternative facts, as Kellyanne Conway all too tragically correctly said. Do we then become, as journalists, educators? Do we concentrate like educators on outcomes? Should we value our worth on whether we convince the public to wear masks? Does that make us advocates? Well, perhaps we must be. Fourth, I think that we have to reconsider what it means to inform the public. It's not just about giving them information. We have to inform the public about each other. And here I think that a key job of media, and a job that I wish that Facebook and Twitter and technology companies would take on, is to make strangers less strange, to take away the power of the other that is being demonized by authoritarians like our own Donald Trump. That means in the end that we're going to bring other voices out. We're going to help those voices speak. We're going to give them a safe space to share their life stories and their circumstances so others can understand them. We're going to share the microphone. We're going to share power with them. We're going to value the diversity of these voices. If we're informing the public about the public, we first have to be informed ourselves about the public, and we have to become better at listening. That is a big task. Fifth, we need to recapture the means to argue. That might sound very strange to say because all we're doing is arguing, but we're not arguing. We're not debating. We're not discussing. We're yelling at each other. And that's fairly normal for the early days of print. Some of the first things to come off the printing press in Mainz were the pamphlets in the bishops' war there, fighting with each other for each side off the press. We need to recapture a sense of productive debate and getting somewhere. And I would point you to a company called Spaceship Media in the US, which does exactly what my definition of journalism says. It convenes communities into respectful, informed, and productive conversation. It develops a methodology to help people get across their points, ask questions better, understand each other better. That's the kind of journalistic skill that we must develop. This leads to 6. We need better tools for collaboration. And I don't just mean the lip-syncing music on TikTok that I mentioned before, but in trying to solve society's issues. Look at the miracle of Wikipedia, that it brings together phenomenal amounts of information from the public. And it creates that platform. Now, of course, it is built for consensus, not for debate. It is built for what they call the neutral point of view. That won't work for this. But I do think we need platforms where sides in a debate can present their best arguments, their greatest nuance to each other, and then the citizens can decide. We think that's our job in journalism, to summarize everything in a quote or two, but that's proven not to work today. So how can we use the abundance of the internet to enable smart people and experts to share their arguments backed up by evidence? That's what we need in society. My 7th suggestion: death to the mass. Stop treating people as if they are all the same, as if we are one. We are not. We are individuals. What the internet kills, I think, is mass media's business model, thus mass media, thus the idea of the mass. The sociologist Raymond Williams once said, "There are no masses, only ways of seeing people as masses." The entire idea of the mass is an insult to the public to think that they are all the same. And I get really upset when I see headlines in newspapers saying, Twitter says, or Twitter is upset by. There is no one monolith called Twitter. That is trying to see Twitter as a mass. No, Twitter is millions of individual voices we can reach out to and listen to and learn from and enter into dialogue with, but not if we treat them as a faceless mask. My 8th idea is that we need in media to provide a better mirror to the conversation. Because right now, all we do is say, Twitter says, or we have opinion polls. We reduce everyone in society to binaries, to red or blue or black or white or 99% or 1%. We need to find ways in which we bring out the nuance of people in how we mirror who they are and what they're saying. The late scholar James Carey from Columbia University says that political opinion polling was probably a death to the conversation in democracy. For what he says is that opinion polling preempts the conversation it is meant to measure. It reduces you to those non-nuanced buckets, those binary views, when you have much more to say. So we've got to figure out how to look at this gigantic conversation where everyone can now speak who is connected and understand better how to listen and then how to present that back as a mirror. Because that's really what journalism does, according to James Carey, is it presents us a reflection of ourselves. And I don't think we're doing that well. And then 9th, Our role in this in media is that we must develop a human voice and leave behind our institutional voice. Our institutional voice is not trusted in many quarters. It is inauthentic. It's not true to ourselves. So those are just 9 opportunities that I think there are to still build what we can have in society on the internet. And by the way, when I hear people complain in Germany that America has Google and America has Facebook and America has Twitter, well, this is your opportunity to build something new. This is the chance to take the German obsession with Datenschutz and give us something that is built with privacy in mind to give us control over our information in ways in which we can choose to share it for the benefit of society. There are tremendous opportunities here. I want to mention, and I think it'll be also in the talk following me, that, as I said before, there is much we can learn from the scientists. I'm fascinated to see how they adapted their needs to the tools of an open information ecosystem in the pandemic. They needed to share information with each other, and so they used preprint servers to get papers out fast. And there are now tens of thousands of scientific papers out. Not all of them are good. It's confusing to find them. So they built structures to find that information. And then I'm fascinated by this. Among the now 600 scientists in my COVID Twitter list, which, by the way, you can find at bit.ly/COVID Twitter list. Among them, they use Twitter to peer review these papers and the findings of each other. It's absolutely fascinating to see how they, hours after a paper is put on the preprint server, they will come back with point-by-point reaction and questions, doing what scientists do. They have had peer review since Cicero, and now they're using Twitter to do it. They also use Twitter to peer review the peers, each other, and say who is more qualified and less qualified. And they use social media to explain things to us, the public. So what we see there is that science and medicine adapted to the needs they had in a pandemic and the opportunities they had in an open information ecosystem in a matter of weeks, in ways far better than we have done yet in decades in media. They give us a model. So there is tremendous work to do. But my good news is, or perhaps you'll consider it bad news, is that we have time. If you look at the timeline of media past, 1450 or thereabouts, we have Gutenberg's press. It was not until a century and a half later that we had what the academic Dror Varman calls print 2.0, in which people stood back and said, what can we really do with this? And it was around 1600 that we had the invention of essays with Montaigne, and we had the invention of the modern novel with Cervantes, and we had the invention of the newspaper, taking from handwritten, mailed correspondence and putting this in print. The first newspaper in Strasbourg in 1605, a century and a half. That tells me we have much time here to figure out what there's going to come. It wasn't until 1800 that the technology changed greatly with steel presses and stereotyping. And the mid part of that century, we got steam, which created the mass media that I now lament in many ways. And it got to 1900 or the 1890s, we get the linotype, which finally takes away the task of what Gutenberg learned to do of putting letter after letter after letter onto a page. We get broadcast at 1900, we get television in the 1950s, and now we're at 2020. And of course, what I left out in that timeline is the internet, which is about 25 years ago, the commercial browser came out, which opened up the net to most everyone who could be there. So that, in that thinking, we're only at the year 1475 in Gutenberg time. It's early. Now, I spoke with a German regulator at a panel and a conference in Perugia, Italy, now a year and a half ago. And I said, this is not necessarily an easy adjustment. And ahead of us, there may well be a 30 years war. I said this as a joke, and he earnestly said it was too soon to joke about the 30 years war. So for that, I apologize. But we might have much disruption and difficulty going ahead, but eventually we figure this out. And we will, and we have time. So I want to tell you a quick story to end about the coffee houses of England, where Jürgen Habermas says that the public sphere was born. And there are many, many academics who disagree with that. I'm not an academic, but I also disagree with that. I think that publics were created around many things, around Martin Luther deciding to publish in the vernacular in German and speak to a public, around painting, around books, around plays, around printed sermons. All these things create publics around ideas. But the coffee houses were very, very important in the development of the press, at least in England as and elsewhere, because they brought together people who couldn't afford necessarily to buy the newspapers. There weren't enough newspapers to go around, but for the price of coffee, they could read newspapers and they could read books and they could discuss and debate this together. Habermas insists this is a rational and critical debate. That's where the debate comes, whether that's true. In any case, we know that coffee houses became a conduit, a vector of news in their time. It kept alive this notion of discussion around issues. He's very, very right that this was an important model for how we should think of ourselves. And as I looked at the history of coffee houses recently, I'm trying to work on a book about Gutenberg, I saw that there came a point in the early 1700s where the coffee houses resented the money they paid to the publishers for the newspapers, which their customers expected to have. And so they decided they were going to start their own newspaper. And they were going to put slates in every coffee house where customers could write the news they knew. And twice a day they'd be collected and then printed in a newspaper and brought back to the coffee houses. And the coffee house owners said that they would then stop subscribing to the newspapers and they would ask the government for a monopoly over the news. Well, I'm fascinated by this because if you think about it in our terms today, the coffee houses needed news as content for their business. And the news publishers needed the coffee house as distribution for their business. And they came into conflict. My only point of the story is, it is ever thus. When we think we have brand new fights today about how the media world should operate with the platforms, and we think it is brand new and that they are brand new and that our situation is brand new, it is not. We have much to learn from history. And by that, I don't mean that history will repeat itself or even that history sings in harmony, but we have lessons to learn because right now we have choices to make. And the more we understand the world we are coming from, that is Gutenberg's world, the more we can understand the choices we made then as a society and what worked and what did not work, the better choices we can make going forward. And we come from an age of orality before print, where things were about speaking. We go into an age of literacy and text and reading and McLuhan. Then we come to the internet and the age perhaps of the mouth, of speaking. But we have to remember that age of listening. We have to bring these skills together again so that we can enter into a civilized, a respectful, informed, and productive debate. It is our job in journalism, our job in media, to serve that public conversation. Yes, there's a perfect fire going on, but that is the perfect time to reimagine and reinvent what news can be and should be in this world. So I thank you very, very much for this award, which I don't deserve, but I can't wait to get it here. And I thank you more for your kind attention and this opportunity to speak about trying to become yet more radical about news. Vielen, vielen Dank.